Welcome back to Demystify Sci. Today we are talking about the metaphysical foundations of knowledge. And we have with us for this discussion Kehlan Morgan, who runs a really interesting YouTube channel called Formscapes, where he explores the intersection between religion, metaphysics, esotericism, science, and philosophy. And we sit down with him to talk about the modern project of seeking knowledge, which has for the last few hundred years been a deeply rational one. And that deeply rational project has been very entwined with mathematics, which has super mystical foundations. And the result of what seems to be a linear project of getting closer and closer to the truth of the phenomenon has in the last 100 years dissolved into a sea of relativistic understanding that has left us with the sense that reality is fundamentally unknowable, there's no ground truth, and that we are simply these random pieces of driftwood on a sea of chaos, and things might happen and things might not happen, but to seek real understanding of why they happen is a project that we have completely abandoned. And because Kehlan is so well versed in the history of philosophy and the history of thought, he's able to really pick apart where these processes come from, what they have produced in our minds, and the effects that these constructions have on us as we live in the world. And so, foundationally, what we're really trying to get at is this exploration of the metaphysics of how we understand the world. If rationalism has created a situation where there is no ground truth, and nothing is knowable at its most fundamental level, is it possible that we need something else that will allow us to answer not just the question of the mathematical how, but a deeper, more spiritual question of why? Why do things happen, not just how?
Why do they appear so probabilistic and relativistic? What's going on? So it's a really valuable conversation. It circles around all of our favorite topics, and we think you're going to love it. Before we start, remember, the show is entirely supported by patrons. That means we don't sell any products, we don't have any sponsors, we don't plaster ads across this, and we aim to keep it that way. You can help us do that by checking out our patron page, which is patreon.com/demystifysci, and consider just carving off the tiniest piece of your paycheck to make sure that we can put more and more of our time towards doing better shows. It would be wonderful for us to be able to hire some help with a lot of the drudgery associated with keeping a podcast running twice a week. And we need to put more time towards reading material for these interviews. So help us out. You can also join our inner crew. We get together once a week every Sunday and kick it over Zoom with our patrons. And it is an absolutely incredible group of people. So I'd love to see you there. If you don't have any money right now, that's cool. Go over and leave us a positive review at Spotify or wherever you're listening to this. Leave a comment down below. Share it with somebody. There's a lot of things you can do to help us grow this project into something that has a lot of power behind it. And we want to use that power to understand the universe. And so do you. That's why you're here. So I'll see you over at Patreon, or I'll see you down in the comments section, and enjoy the conversation.
See you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
When we're asking a question like, can a computer do consciousness? I think that we've kind of got the question backwards already. I don't think it's right to think of matter as something that does consciousness so much as it's better to think of matter as almost more of a medium through which different possibilities of consciousness can come to actualize themselves. And so one point of entry here, I think, would be this argument that I've heard many times. I believe it's Bernardo Kastrup who originally kind of put it like this, but I know Bernardo said this. He says, well, people who think computers can be conscious just don't understand how computers work. And then he says, so Bernardo says, well, any kind of computational system, any kind of computer program is something that you can, at least in principle, build out of a giant system of pipes and valves. And so of course he's kind of tugging on your intuitions. Like he's saying, look, if you saw a giant system of pipes and valves doing what ChatGPT does or whatever, you would not think that is consciousness because, I mean, obviously there's no decision making going on whether the valve is being turned on or off. That's the intuition that he's trying to implicate here. And on the one hand, I think that does point towards a pretty fundamental distinction between mechanical processes and organismic processes, which is certainly worth talking about. But at the same time, I feel like there is possibly something very misleading there, because if we look at a giant system of pipes and valves, and we're actually imagining that giant system of pipes and valves is doing what ChatGPT does, spitting out human language, then that implies that machine is not just a system of pipes and valves. It is interwoven with all of these utterances, all of these books, all of these just the internet, the collective unconscious, just all of this stuff. And, if you took all that away, then it would just be a system of pipes and valves. It wouldn't be able to do anything, though, right? So if you're thinking of the system as just the mechanical gears flipping around, then you're missing the big picture, because really that's just an organ of something much larger. Because the possibility that's opened up there, I would say, is that different processes, different systems within the human consciousness at large could potentially act through a system like that. And that could be done in ways that are purposive, that there's a teleology there. There could be archetypal beings, let's say, that are able to tug things in certain directions based on how they might manifest themselves through these technologies. And so if you're looking at it that way, then the question isn't whether the pipes and valves are conscious or not. The question is, what kinds of consciousness are coming to realize themselves and enact themselves through things like that? And we could apply the exact same logic to the human body in a way, I would say.
I think that's the scary thing for people about these AI systems, is that they don't have a sense of whether what spirits will manifest through these systems are benevolent or not. Maybe something far, far not. Like, that's the dystopian narrative. But it seems too early to say. Like, as far as we can tell, a lot of our technologies come down to how they're implemented, right? You can build an A-bomb, or you can make thorium reactors that save the world with cheap energy for eternity. So it's like, that's a genuine bifurcation point that I feel like is...
I mean, yeah, but like a person can grow up to be Hitler, a person can grow up to be Gandhi. And so there's still that same innate thing that once you open, because Don Hoffman calls this a portal to consciousness. And so each portal that you open has a different vibe to it, let's say. But I think about this, the way that we talk about machines and their consciousness, we talk about them as like, okay, well, if you just had the machine, you would just have the system of pipes and valves. And I'm like, that's true. But if you took away all of the cultural programming from a human, like a baby that's born and then is left in the woods and survives, or is at a Romanian orphanage and never gets any attention, never learns language, you also kind of have you expose the bare workings of the series of pipes and valves that are the human mind. And I've never thought about this before, but I'm like, do those humans embody any of these cultural archetypes? Do they have any of this sort of conventional, what we would call...
humanity?
Yeah, like human consciousness. And I'm like, obviously they're still human, But whenever we say consciousness, it's this very nebulous term because it means something different depending on who we apply it to and what circumstances we're using it in.
Right. Yeah. And so even with like if we imagine a scenario like a child being left in the woods to raise themselves or whatever, even within that, so, I mean, certainly you're going to have less, you would say, than what would be the case if a person was actually raised in a community by a family and culturally conditioned in the way that is typically the case. But even with someone who is born and raised themselves on a desert island, insofar as they are animate at all, there's still going to be some kind of tuning into something bigger than themselves. Like the body has to figure out how to make a heart that can beat, a nervous system that can communicate the different parts of the body to one another. Again, this is kind of like getting at we're getting into very esoteric territory really quickly here, but this is where I think we would start talking about things like morphic resonance, right? Because this idea that really, if we think about the metaphysical implications of that, it means that animacy itself, what makes the human body something other than just an inert, bag of pipes and valves, is that relationality, that capacity to tune into this kind of collective animacy, collective memory, collective purposiveness. Without that, what are you left with? I mean, even at like if we scale this down to the level of cells and molecules and whatnot, I would say that there's something like that going on there as well. But to bring this to say a thing about the technological aspect of this real quick, though, so you said that a person can grow up to be a Hitler or a serial killer, or they can be Gandhi, and so there's variability there. Certainly with human beings and really just organisms in general. With technology, though, I think maybe one thing that is missing from discussions like this is the way that we think about purposiveness. We think of a human being as, driven by some kind of desire to live a better life, to be happy, to experience some kind of fulfillment or whatnot. We don't usually ask, what do technologies want? What does electricity want? What does atomic energy want? What does ChatGPT want? What are they doing? And if you look at the history here and start thinking of these things in that kind of teleological manner, then I think certain things start to become disclosed. There, you could start to say that electricity wants to become the nervous system of, you could say, the noosphere or whatever, right? Of the this kind of technological nervous system that we're creating.
It's funny because physicists do say, electricity wants to ground it, like a conductive wire wants to ground itself, or the current wants to flow to ground. That's probably what you would hear more often. And that's interesting because it implies there is some sort of form of its behavior that is almost teleological in that sense.
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Couldn't you recast all rules of physics as wants?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at here, because if you pressed most physicists or even computer scientists on this, they would probably say, well, we're just kind of using that language metaphorically, but it's not real teleology. But then you got to ask, well, then what's the difference? I mean, where exactly do you draw the line between something that acts in every way as though it is purposive and then actually being purposive?
Especially because it's not like simple kinematic diagrams that you do in high school where, there's a pulley on a string and the weight can be balanced out and you like have this mechanical understanding of what's happening. But particularly with a lot of basic everyday physics, like why we're sticking to the floor right now, or how this light is allowing me to see you on the screen right now, those things don't terminate in those, like, we're not offered a mechanical explanation for these things. And so the want becomes very primary, that sort of esoteric, the forces or the desire of these bodies to get close to each other becomes primary in these presentations. So they can say it's an analogy all they want, but that's what they're saying literally too.
Right. And it's interesting that the lack of a mechanical explanation for gravity. I mean, it's wild how much thinking about these things has changed over time. If we look back at Isaac Newton, you know, he's got his famous statement that he feigned no hypothesis for gravity. And, you know, he was making it really clear, like, hey, I've got a mathematical model that can be used to describe and calculate gravity, but I have no idea what gravity is. I mean, he literally believed that it was some kind of divine force that was beyond the reach of natural science, because he believed that natural science was limited to that which could be explained in mechanical terms. And so it's interesting to really look at the way we think of explanation in general. What does it mean to actually understand something? What does it mean to actually know what's actually going on? I mean, Newton was very clear that he didn't know what was actually going on. But now you've got this very strange thing where it's like you've got all of this mathematics that, and you know, some of it is, you know, extremely arcane, and you seem to get one of two attitudes out of physical science. Either one is that somehow the mathematics actually is the explanations, like the mathematics is actually what makes the stars go around and whatnot. Or alternatively, you have this much more kind of defeatist attitude, which is, well, the human mind just isn't actually capable of understanding the world.
Oh, it's the worst one.
I know, right? I hate it so much. It's like it's just completely beyond us. Our stupid monkey brains just can't figure it out. And so the equations are just the best we can do. And honestly, I think that's the more prominent one these days.
That's the one I heard in high school.
Yeah, and it's just so wild how deeply anti-scientific that is, right? Like it's like the whole project of science is the idea that we can understand the world because human understanding is part of the world. Like, this is nature and we are also nature. So you would expect that when we start digging into the compositionality of the human being and the compositionality of the world, there's got to be some kind of congruity there. And I just don't think that people realize that when you throw that away and you're just like, oh, well, we just can't imagine what an 11-dimensional hyperspace could be. Well, you can't imagine what it could be because it's not real. It's a fantasy that we've cooked up. And I mean, that might sound kind of hyperbolic, but I mean it. I just think that and this is where we could really start getting.
It alienates enough people that they throw themselves in the latter bag where they're like, well, I'm just not smart enough to understand it. It's funny because you mentioned Newton's hypothesis non fingo, and it's weird because it seems like the only thing that's changed is in the post-Einsteinian world, we don't have the humility to say that we're still just describing the phenomena. We're not actually explaining it. And so we've reified this grid of coordinates and change. So like space-time, it's been reified into a substance. So most people on the street are like, oh yeah, the goop, the space-time goop. And it's like, hold on a second. Like, that's not a material construct. That's actually an idea, an abstraction that's been reified into a goop. And so it tastes like an explanation, right? It's like one of those fake natural flavors or something. It's like, oh, this tastes good, but it's like got nothing in it, right? They're just covering up some stink. So, yeah, I don't know, man. That's really profound.
So
and with, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say with the space time and the goop, as it were. You know, Einstein, even like, it was only like 10 years or so that Einstein actually even believed that. By 1920, he had decided that, okay, if there's, like I'm saying, that there's some kind of space-time goop, then that's got to be something. And so he made it very clear, like, there's got to be some kind of an ether in order for these things to be possible. And physics just completely ignored him. I mean, it's wild to and you see this in several things actually. It's crazy to the degree to which the people who really want to put Einstein on a pedestal, and I'm sure he was certainly a genius in many ways, but the people who really deify his ideas are the people who tend to pay the least attention to what he actually said, and this is a very common thing with just kind of deifying figures in general, I would say.
Absolutely. There's the arc of a career, right? Oftentimes Nobel Prize winners will then start to work on other stuff. Linus Pauling is a great example of this.
Mhm.
He's so well renowned, wins Nobel Prizes, and then basically goes down the path of vitamin C cures everything from cancer to heart disease. And everyone's like, oh, Linus. And nobody ever listens to him again. And I think that there's a functional question here. What does having an explanation let you do? And this is something that Michael Levin always talks about, because he's saying that there's this bioelectric condition for organisms that allows them to be programmed. And he approaches it from a philosophical lens of the desire of cells. And his philosophy talks are often denigrated by his colleagues because they point to the science and they say, hey, this is really interesting, and you should really cut the philosophy out. But Levin's whole point is that no, your philosophy is valuable insofar as it lets you do something. And so if the philosophy is, okay, we have the math, and we need to go one step farther to actually find an explanation, where does that lead us? What does that let us actually do once we have that?
Yeah, that's great, and that really brings into focus kind of um the kind of pragmatist aspect of this. So before we were discussing this a little bit, and I was talking about the way, and we were talking about how Alexander Unziker has pointed to this as well. This idea that there was this major shift around World War II pertaining to attitudes towards science and really just the idea that nature can even be understood, which largely I would say has to do with this migration of the epicenter of science from Europe to the United States. And the way that I've talked about this and the way that Unziker has talked about this has been pretty derogatory, frankly, because the way that it's manifested, it's come about in this very just capitalistic, entrepreneurial, just whatever makes the numbers turn out right type of attitude. But if you really look at American pragmatist philosophy, people like William James and Charles Sanders Peirce, John Dewey, there's another kind of American attitude towards this, which is the attitude of, okay, these ideas are cool and all, but where does the rubber meet the road? How does this actually pertain directly to my actual experience of not just being in the world, but living in it? And that's important here as well, I think, because ideas, theories, philosophies, these are not just inert, things in museums that we go and poke at and judge. I mean, the way that we see the world is the way that we are oriented towards it. And a lot of these ideas might seem, very far removed from that orientation. Like, okay, so what is figuring out what light is really like? What is that going to have to do with the way that I like wash my dishes in the morning? Probably not anything very direct, but nonetheless, there's always a big picture that's being sketched out by these more specific theoretical concerns, and that big picture does necessarily line up with questions about morality, about what matters, about why we're here, about what we're doing, about what kind of sacrifices are worth making. And so I think that is the thing that the American attitude brings to the table that's really important. And certainly you see that in Michael Levin, and in Tesla too. This is another interesting thing. Tesla was part of this European tradition, but he was nobody. He was just some guy obsessed with electricity. But when he came to the United States, brought over here by the Continental Edison Company, it didn't matter that he wasn't part of one of these highbrow intellectual lineages of like elite philosophers. It didn't matter that he was just some guy, right? Because the American attitude is just not as concerned with that kind of thing. It's concerned with the fact that Tesla could light up New York. And again, that brings us back to the pragmatics of it. So yeah. Anyway, about Levin though, yeah, absolutely. The fact that he's not only is he taking philosophy seriously, but he's taking philosophy seriously in terms of the way that it actually informs how we do experiments and that kind of thing. I think it is absolutely central. Yeah.
And so, were you gonna go somewhere?
I had a thought, but I'm holding on to it for a second.
Okay. There's something about understanding that informs deeper action. Because you can act in any number of ways. And go for it.
Along those lines, I think what's really important here about the act of understanding is that if you believe the world can be understood, then you can start to order it into something meaningful. And it goes back to what we were talking about with the physicists earlier, why it's so heartbreaking when you're 14 years old and your physics instructor says that we're just not smart enough to understand. That's so disempowering, and if it's foundational to our Western science and all of our policy and everything is informed by our science, an argument could be made anyways that it is, that's a really shaky foundation for everything that comes on top of it.
Right. And so if we're disempowering ourselves in that way, well, then we're not steering the ship anymore. So what's steering the ship?
And how can you not become nihilistic as a society at that point, right? And hedonistic and sort of fuck all to purpose and things like this.
Well, I feel like it must have been a functional adaptation to get rid of these questions, right? Because I think that Newton comes around and he comes up with a mathematical way of talking about motion, which breaks open this massive engineering ability. Because really, if you need to design a machine, you need to be able to think about motion, and you need to be able to parameterize it in equations. And as soon as you have that ability, you've unlocked some next level. Like if you were playing Civilization or something, that would be a key development.
Well, you're ordering, right? You're trimming down the things that you're paying attention to, and you're ordering them into relationships that hold steady.
That hold steady, and then allows you to become the creator. In many ways. It's this moment of transition between being the subject of creation and being the creator, because you immediately, upon the discovery of these equations, start to move in the direction of massive feats of power, right? Granted, it takes a few hundred years before these things really kick off, but I think that it's hard to point to the Industrial Revolution as starting anywhere except for calculus. And so it seems functional to dismiss all these questions of spirit as being immaterial and not very valuable, because what you're really after is you're after these very, very pressing questions of how are you going to feed these people? How are you going to house these people? How are you going to make enough clothes for them? How are you going to be able to transport all of the goods that you have acquired from the farthest reaches of your empire to feed the maw of your factories? Those are the questions that suddenly become important. And anybody who's wandering around and talking about God and spirit and vis vivo or anything else is seen as working against that project, because if you attach this moral nature to your scientific and engineering goals, I think it stops you from progress. In a lot of ways. I think about this in terms of animal research all the time. It's neuroscience research especially.
We have to define what progress is, I suppose, at some point. It's like you can have all of the technology in the universe and still be a really degenerate, unhappy population.
Well, and I think that you could argue that we are. not to throw that around too easily. But I guess the point that I'm making is that, okay, so you have technological progress, and so you can move forward. But if you look at neuroscience, right, the foundation for a ton of I think a lot of this stuff that's trying to be done with computers right now, with artificial intelligence networks, it's coming out of neuroscience, and they're feeding back and forth between each other. There's this massive goal to understand the brain, how the nervous system works. You look at the body of experiments that people have done to do that, and it is horrifying. You know, it's we took cats, and in order to see how their walking behaviors are transmitted, we would sever their spines in different locations and then put them on treadmills, and, you know, monkeys with shunts in their brains and all kinds of crazy things. And it would turn the stomach of someone who sees divinity everywhere. And so in order to become this functional piece of an engine that continues to produce progressively more obscure and difficult to reach knowledge, you have to let go of that part of yourself, because how could you not?
Yeah, and so it was asked what is progress here. This is really the question, then, isn't it? What are we doing? And this directly relates to questions of what real understanding is. And again, there's something pragmatic about that. You really understand something when you're able to engage with it efficaciously. But what is efficacious? And this is why I've been really looking to how this idea of the project of science, which is very closely related to the project of Western civilization itself, how this has changed over time. We go back to the medieval alchemists, right? And these cats were very explicit about what they were doing. They were trying to uncover the underlying archetypal nature of reality in order to transmute lead into gold, because for them, doing that was the same thing fundamentally, archetypally, as achieving the Christian project of theosis, of spiritualizing the human being, including the human body, which is why the lead is significant, because it's like the bodily, it's gravity, it's Saturn, it's physicality. And so there's this really interesting thing then where it was like, and that idea didn't just die with the alchemists. I mean, this continued to some degree or another throughout the history of science. This idea that science itself was compelled by some kind of spiritual project of transforming the world into something new, creating a new humanity and whatnot. And it's strange how this is played out. So Carl Jung has this lovely idea that I found extremely illuminating. He calls it enantiodromia, the way in which, when, let's say, spiritual forces, for lack of a better term, lose contact with their underlying logos, their underlying ethos, what happens is they mutate into these kind of perverse mirror images of themselves, right? And this is something that
Can you give an example of a archetypical spirit or?
So, like, I think probably a really great example of this would be like the French Revolution, where you have these ideas of human liberation and of looking towards the future, of free thought and whatnot. And then as gradually that project loses contact with its own inner purpose, it mutates and mutates, and then bada bing, bada boom, you have this reenactment of the Roman Empire with Napoleon, right? And so, and this is something, again, if I keep giving more examples, they're probably going to get more and more political, but you definitely see this in political ideologies a lot. A political ideology will grow and it will spread, and then once it starts to really come into major conflicts through which it is attempting to seize power or whatever, these sacrifices start being made with regards to the relationship between that project and the underlying purposiveness of the project that animated it to begin with. And then you get this enantiodromia. There's this kind of mutation where there's this very poetic irony to it, but it just seems to happen naturally, where these things become kind of perverse mirror images of themselves. Now, Carl Jung, when he described this, he was talking about it in terms of individual psychology, the way that people will have some kind of goal in mind, or they will want things to be a certain way, and then because of this weird dynamic of the conscious and the unconscious, it'll be like we end up creating exactly what it seemed like we were trying to avoid, for example. And as Jung saw it, that was, that's not an accident. That is that there's a reason why it works that way. But I'm bringing this up in relation to science and whatnot, because I think if we're looking at like what the alchemists were trying to do and that whole project, that didn't die. It just turned into a weird mirror image of itself, because we see it today in transhumanism. That's exactly what that is. They think that they're achieving the kingdom of heaven through technology. But again, it's kind of a perverse mirror image in a lot of ways. The transhumanists, their view, I mean, if you look at somebody like Ray Kurzweil, for example, Ray Kurzweil is, if you actually read him, you can see it. His thought is just dripping with disgust at the human body, at nature. He doesn't trust nature. He sees nature as this blind, deaf, dumb, eldritch alien force that just happened to slap us together in a certain way. And transcendence for Kurzweil then means defeating nature, overcoming nature by use of machine technologies. So again, you take that idea and you look at it and you compare it to that kind of original alchemical project of spiritualizing matter. That's exactly what you see, I think, in Antiadromia. It's a perverse mirror image, because that same kind of underlying ethos is still compelling it, but it's lost contact with its reason for being.
Is there an alchemical analogy for this? Like you try to turn lead into gold and it turns into
Cyanide.
Yeah, cyanide. I don't know, something terrible.
Not that I'm aware of,
Okay,
no.
that's
But maybe I'm not sure. I can't think of an example of that. No.
Well, there is a functional parallel, because as you try to turn lead into gold, you're inevitably working with mercury and caustic chemicals, and so you're poisoning yourself as you try to achieve this ultimately idealistic goal.
Like with the Chinese alchemists, they wanted to achieve immortality, and so they were eating mercury, and it killed them. So yeah, actually, you do actually see examples of this in alchemy, don't you? I was thinking of that. Yeah.
I'm watching. Have you been following Brian Johnson at all? Who's the guy who's trying to revert himself back to the age of 18?
No, I have not heard of this at all, actually.
That's amazing. So he is some tech, either upper millionaire or lower billionaire, and decided that he was going to get into longevity research. And so he started this company called Blueprint, and is just getting all kinds of therapies and injections, and has this, I think he takes more than 100 different pills a day in order to turn back the clock. And he has this team of doctors that's constantly measuring his vital signs, which is really interesting because he does seem to be changing. He looks different than he did 10 years ago before he started the project, but it's creepy.
What could possibly go wrong?
He doesn't look super healthy to me. And that's such an inevitable end to this project, right? Because you want to destroy nature. You want to work against it. You want to be able to break these patterns that have emerged. And so you turn to a technological approach that you think has given you this power of creation.
Right. And if you look at like the Christian project, or really just any kind of spiritual traditions, I mean, they're a very common motif is transcending death. In Plato, you see this, that philosophy itself is a kind of preparation for death. Die before you die, so that when you die, you live forever, or however that saying goes, right? I mean, this is a very common thing, and yet within this kind of transhumanist ethos, again, it's just turned completely upside down, because they're trying to transcend death, not by spiritualization, but through literally just making the physical body last forever. And so again, it's like this. It's almost funny. It's almost ironic, were it not for the potential for really horrific things to come out of it. But
I think it points at some really old and important confusion that happened. I think, especially like alchemy is a great example where it's this metaphorical transmutation of the soul, essentially, right? But if you just come at it from a Western material science background and you read it and take it literally, of course it sounds like quackery, right? It's like, oh, that none of those processes work. Like, we don't have to pay attention to this. And it evolves to the point that in Western scientific practice, we've lost all ability to look beyond these material interactions. Physics perhaps being aside, like fundamental physics being a strange exception to this rule. But it seems like we've been diverted from that project because we're incapable of looking at phenomena on these two different levels at once. And I think this is something Steiner is talking about in the book that you sent us. Mm-hmm. How it's nearly impossible to hold these two perspectives in your mind at the same time.
I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about how do you survive in a society if you maintain a spiritual connection? Like, can you really be a scientist and maintain the sanctity of the spirits of the animals that you're having to poison and maim in order to do your research? The same thing if you are...
Who was that scientist who became completely ascetic and ended up killing himself? The guy who
the game theory guy?
Yeah, the game theory guy who just took Christianity extremely literally, all the charity aspects and everything, and he had all these homeless people living in his house, and it just destroyed him, actually. He just...
Oh, wow.
I think he ended up severing his jugular vein with a pair of nail clippers.
Jesus Christ.
I know, super dark.
Because he just realized he couldn't do it. Like, he couldn't actually do it, right? And it's like, for most people, I think, let's say Christians, for example, best case scenario, they're like, well, I should aspire to live in this Christ-like way. But being this kind of, on the spectrum literalist about it, he just couldn't, he was all or nothing for him. And the all just turned out to be too much for his psyche to handle.
And that's an extreme example of kind of what I'm talking about, where I think that there is something about pastoralism and living on the land that allows you to maintain a sense of divinity. You are at the mercy of something much larger than yourself. You're farming, and your farming is dependent upon the rains and the winds and the temperature. And you are subject to this unmovable force that you realize you're smaller than it constantly. And you realize that you owe something to it. And so, which is why you have all of these sacrifice rituals, why you have all of these complex social processes by which you try to show nature that you respect its power. And then when you move into the city and you begin work in factories and you begin work for the empire, all of a sudden the thing that you are subject to is no longer the divine force of nature. You are subject to the divine force of empire, which has very different goals. And it has very different flavors and characteristics when it comes to the ends that will put you to work for. Because it's not necessarily the goals of nature. It now becomes the goals of this larger system in which you exist.
Oh boy! All right, this could branch us out in all kinds of different directions. So pertaining to that guy you were talking about, that really makes me think. So Alfred North Whitehead has this book called Adventures of Ideas, in which he's kind of just sketching out the history of Western thought as philosophers do. But there was one particular thing that he said in that really stood out to me, pertaining to the advent of Christianity within the Western world. And he said that, and I'm probably misphrasing this, but he said something along the lines of the impossibility of Christianity was its strength. The fact that it just was not achievable, the fact that it was so radical that believing in it just had nothing to do with any kind of practical considerations. It didn't matter. It was that kind of faith where it was like the very impossibility of it somehow was the driving energy which allowed it to do what it did. That's a wild thought. And once you start taking that and start thinking, okay, well, how does that connect to everything else? And you start looking at things like transhumanism or like Marxism, right? And the idea of achieving a kind of post-capitalistic utopia and things like that. It's like somehow there's this underlying kernel, this underlying impulse that's infected us following the emergence of Christianity. And it's such a mysterious thing. It's so strange, but somehow it's like everything somehow connects back to that. So Nietzsche is really interesting to bring up here as well, because Nietzsche, so he talks about nihilism as this like historical process by which we're losing contact with our with the transcendental values which allow us to actually orient ourselves towards the world. And so he describes it in these very apocalyptic terms as becoming disconnected from everything. He his passage, The Madman, the God is dead passage, he says, who gave us the sponge with which to wipe away the horizon? Have we not untethered this earth from its sun? Are we not now falling endlessly in all directions? And the way that Nietzsche saw it, and this is maybe a little bit more implicit in his writings, but it's like that's the unachievableness of those values is somehow what was causing that nihilism, that disconnect. The values which were animating Western civilization, because of their very impossibility, or at least their seeming impossibility, that somehow has been what has led to this nihilism, this corrosion of our capacity to even believe in ideals that are real, that are actually capable of recreating the world in a way that is in accordance with what the destiny of humanity is supposed to be. I mean, these are some very far out considerations, but I think this is, I mean, when we're talking about science and alchemy and all that and transhumanism, it all somehow connects back to that, I believe. Though I'm not sure if I can summarize how that works exactly.
And why do you have that Jungian reflection too? Like, why does the beautiful Marxist utopia turn into the Soviet hellscape or the Maoist hellscape? Why does the beautiful doctrine of the Constitution of the United States turn into this repressive, disembodied, cold, like censorship landscape of only certain ideas are even, like, how does that happen? And why does it seem to happen every single time, no matter what? Why does Christianity lead to the Crusades? Like, why does this seem to be a feature, not a bug?
Yeah, that's it's, as Jung saw it, it was performing a function. There's a reason for it. Jung believed that kind of flipping upside down thing is somehow the way that we spiral inward towards what he called the archetypal self, which he identified with the archetype of Christ, this idea of an ultimate realization of what the human being is meant to be. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, especially in Carl Jung's later works with like Ion and the Red Book and whatnot, where he starts to get like really mystical. He starts to talk about astrology and things like that, and he really starts to move towards this idea that kind of like what I was suggesting, that somehow there's this inner tension within Christianity itself, and that we think we've overcome it because we don't our civilization seems so thoroughly secularized, but it's still there, and it's still the thing that's animating this, and it's like it's trying to realize itself. But what is it trying to realize? What's the end goal? What does the kingdom of heaven look like? I mean, hopefully it doesn't involve, loading up homeless people in your house and, offing yourself in some kind of way. I mean, but it's wild. There's it seems like there is this just massive gulf between actuality and the ideals which are implicated in that moral imperative.
I see a role for parasitism here too when I look at these processes. Like I see whether it's corporations realizing they can sell, LGBT t-shirts at Target, or whether it's Mao being like, well, this is actually really appealing, I could probably get a bunch of people behind me on this and then do whatever I want. I feel like there's just this element, there's this spirit of capture that happens in all of these processes to varying degrees, and it's very powerful. Like once you have got your hooks into people with some of these really like magnanimous and beautiful ideas, then you've kind of got this carte blanche to do whatever you want. And it seems like these things get perverted in that way. I mean, it happens in Christianity all the time. We got into watching movie documentaries about cults for a while, and it's so fascinating how it just happens time after time, where you seduce people with something really beautiful and meaning. You give them meaning in their lives, and then there's this bait and switch moment where it's like, now I just want to bang everybody's wife or something, right?
And the cult thing is interesting too, because I think that actually looking at that in particular kind of highlights maybe some things about the trajectory that we're on. Because with a cult, if we compare that to like a traditional like spiritual system or whatever, there's some really big differences there, even though they kind of appear to be doing the same thing. But when you look at just the spiritual tradition of any culture at all, what you've got is a life system which is specifically oriented towards orienting human beings in a certain way, transforming human beings in a certain way. And occasionally you do have these kind of mythical figures like Lao Tzu or Zoroaster or Christ, for example, who are said to have created these, but at the same time, these are, we have to admit, these kind of organic systems that have evolved over time in accordance with the actual needs of human life. If you like, cults don't last long, generally speaking, if they kill everybody and create all this animosity. Like there's this need for these things, and it is kind of Darwinian in a way to actually further human life in some sense. And for most of human history, your spiritual tradition is just that of the culture you were born into. That's all there was to it. There wasn't much room for some wannabe guru to come in and suck everybody into a compound and start banging everybody's wives, right? Like that just, people wouldn't take somebody like that seriously because their spiritual tradition was just the one that was handed down to them, and just by the very nature of how that works, that had to be something at least functional, right? But now things are a bit different because we are so individualized. We're not necessarily just born into our spiritual traditions anymore. We're not just born into our beliefs anymore, our worldview. We have this capacity for a kind of individual intellectual agency. And I think that is something that has been kind of created through this historical process. That if we trace it back through modernity and then the Middle Ages and then the late Roman Empire and all that, you see this very clear trajectory of human beings becoming more individualized. But there's all kinds of dangers, of course, that opens up. And one of them is the cult thing, right? Because then you've got this thing where people can make decisions about what they believe and who they trust and who they follow. And yes, that absolutely opens up this possibility for parasitism, where a crazy person can be like, "Oh, I've got all the answers. Just come with me." Wink, wink, like, and well, it's not even wink, wink. The problem is they actually believe it. That's the real danger, is they believe their own They believe the Kool-Aid that they're drinking and giving to everybody else. But what that then indicates, I think, is what's needed here is if you're gonna have that kind of individual freedom, you've also got to have discernment. You've also got to have individual responsibility. And we've created a civilization that doesn't really cultivate those things, right? And there's an immense danger in that.
In the interest of safety, often, right? It's like we're just trying to keep everybody safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so what you end up with is people who aren't who haven't really developed that sense of individual discernment and self-agency, self-efficacy in the way that would be the case if they actually had to, go out and face hardship and things like that. You're living in a civilization that is literally designed to coddle you so that you can just be comfortable going in and out of your office every day. And that leaves this massive vacuum.
I have a feeling that this pegs straight to some sort of deficit in our philosophical education to some extent, because I feel like the way that you learn to discern, the only way you can learn to discern, is by watching two people have a dialogue with opposing perspectives.
Pardon the interruption, but I have a small request. If you are listening to this podcast and you are just awash in the vibrancy of ideas that are on offer, and you think to yourself, man, this is something that I really want to see more of in the world, consider coming over to patreon.com and supporting the show by donating however much you feel like you can spare every month. We appreciate every single dollar that we get. We pour it directly back in the show, not just by buying books, but by hiring people out to help us produce an even better podcast, putting on conferences, and giving us the time to host all of the things that are really valuable to us that we believe makes the world a better place. So come on over, donate, join the community.
That is almost outlawed on YouTube, essentially, at this point. Like, the idea that somebody could have a really challenging perspective is completely out of the question. Like, even in not hot topics, like things like, say, outside of medical misinformation or something, it's very hard for us to even get people in something as, let's say, esoteric as cosmology, right? It's very hard to get a standard cosmologist in the same room with a non-standard cosmologist. It's like there's no place for that in the world right now. And I feel like it's in the time of, I mean, this could be romantic too, but it seems like in the time of the Greeks, that was the way in which knowledge was transmitted. You have these dialogues between these characters. You even represent them in your own work, two different perspectives. And that's how people learn to use their brains, essentially, because they can pick out what makes sense naturally from the consequences of the dialogue. I don't know. So maybe philosophical education could save the day. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think this alludes back to what we were saying about the kind of disempowerment of modern education, the way that it tells you, oh, just shut up and calculate. You don't understand this. Nobody understands this. You're not gonna understand it. Just, this is what we're told, and it works. It works.
It works.
And so it's true. Like, what? Okay, well, what do you mean it works? You mean it works in the sense that it keeps this system running? Well, is that working? Is that what we want?
Is that an endpoint?
Don't get asked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so there's this interesting tension here, because I'm not sure that mysticism necessarily helps us understand how things work any better than mathematics.
It does ask interesting questions, though.
It asks interesting questions, but this comes back to what I was trying to point to earlier, which is that a philosophy has to allow you to achieve something different than what has previously been achieved. And so mathematical philosophy, a la Newton, gave us the Industrial Revolution, everything downstream of it. I think you can draw a direct line between that and transhumanism with a bunch of intervening steps. Okay, so we can see what that philosophy gave us. When we try to bring Steiner's perspectives on the world into these matters, if we try to bring theosophy or any of these mystical traditions back to bear on the questions of nature, where does that lead us? Does it just lead us to reconnect to the divine, which addresses this seemingly eternally recurrent crisis of meaning, or is it something else?
Well, Steiner certainly didn't see it that way. Yeah, we see this, it's very natural, I think, to draw this kind of duality between the kind of mathematical, scientific engineering type approach and then something more mystical, more whatever, transcendental, let's say. I think that very distinction is something that we need to be calling into question. So if we look back, so as I've said before, Steiner's entire project, everything that he did, he believed that it was just the natural consequence of following through on the implications laid out by Goethe. And Goethe did not, interestingly, he did not see his project as like anti-mathematical. It's really interesting because if you look at his works, you don't see any equations or numbers. But when he actually talks about what he's doing, he actually describes it using the language of mathematics. He's like the way that we come to understand the relationships between the phenomena, so as to get to the underlying, the or phenomenon, as he called it, has to be mathematical in the sense that within mathematics, you're taking something and you're unfolding it such that everything is contained within everything else. And so he thought of what he was doing as really fundamentally the same thing that mathematicians are doing, interestingly enough. But moreover, Steiner certainly saw his project as practical, not as just like, achieving some kind of zen where you can sit around and like say Om all day and feel good about yourself or whatever. Like he wanted to change the world. And in very concrete terms. I mean, the dude didn't just write about like, the spiritual hierarchies. He wrote about like beekeeping and agriculture and medicine, and like he believed that really looking at nature in this different way isn't just going to give us an alternative to science. It's going to give us a completely different science. One of his kind of flagship works is called An Outline of Esoteric Science. And I've heard a few people say that, well, it's not really science. Steiner's just kind of playing on this romanticization of science, which was very in the vogue at the time during the 19th and early 20th centuries. But no, Steiner did not see it that way. He saw what he was doing as science, plain and simple, as a science that was more true to empiricism than what the Newtonians were doing. And, I don't want to necessarily indicate that, Steiner got everything right. I mean, he's out there for sure. But at the same time, I think when we look at that, what Steiner and Goethe are doing, it's pointing us in the direction of really rethinking what science can be and what it does. And part of that consideration is going to be what really is the role of mathematics here. Mathematics definitely allows us to make precise predictions, for sure. And that's interesting. And maybe there's something more to be said that's indicated by Goethe, what he said about mathematics and the way that mathematical thinking can play a role even in what we might think of as a more spiritualistic understanding of the world. But yeah, I think there are real practical implications here. When we stop looking at the world as, a bunch of machines and start looking at it as a kind of nested hierarchy of purposive organisms, it changes the way we do things. It could have very real implications for how we do things like agriculture, things like medicine, things like how we do architecture even. I mean, all kinds of things potentially.
Psychology is a big one that sticks out to me as this like attempt, at least early on, to bring spiritual science into existence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems I could be wrong about this, some psychologist is going to yell at me, but it seems like the psychological remnant, the bizarro alternate verse reflection world, is this pharmaceutical thing where you just give people these pills that sort of even them out, and you're just like, well, case closed,
Yeah. And if we look at like psychoanalysis, for example, there's something very and lots of people have pointed this out, the practice of psychoanalysis is in many ways very like the Catholic practice of confession. It's just kind of reconfigured in certain ways. And if you look into like the psychoanalysis in particular, it's one of those things where like the deeper you go into it, the more esoteric it gets. Like Lacan, for example, like at the end of his career, he's talking about like these weird like knot geometries of like toroids folded on in themselves, and I mean it's
To
just
represent
so,
different elements of the psyche?
like it was
Interesting.
so he had this kind of threefold distinction between what did he call it? It was the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, and it formed this kind of like triangle thing. And so at the end of his life, he's playing around with these weird like knot geometries, kind of like a Celtic knot where it like loops around, and he's trying to show the way that these things relate to one another in a way that is very Neoplatonic, very Pythagorean, very mystical. And so, yeah, it's one of those things where like the more we try to get away from the mysticism or pretend that we're not doing it, the more it just pops up in ways where it's just kind of disguised, but like barely, like it's always still there.
Yeah, you just hang a mathematical equation on it and it's science, basically.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
math is very mystical,
Right.
right? The way that it is a language that presents a massive barrier to entry, where there's some people that have access to it and others don't. It feels very liturgical to me.
Especially the stepped, what would you call it? The hierarchy of symbology, right? Like the deeper you get into it, you're given new symbols and you learn how to work with them. There's this hierarchical order of ascending the mathematical knowledge base to the point where, my friends who are mathematicians, they're constantly complaining that nobody understands their papers, right? They're like, there's like 3 people out there who can understand my ideas. And so it's impossible for them to get real criticism.
Do you
Yeah.
think...
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to kind of riff on that a little bit. Yeah, there's like mathematics has always been an esoteric pursuit. I mean, I've actually been reading this book lately. Oh, I'm going to misremember the name of it because I just started reading it, but it's a book on the like mathematics of music theory. And there's this guy, and and in the introduction, it's so telling because this guy was like, a scientist. I believe he was I believe he was a mathematician actually, or a statistician or something like that. And he was trying to do research on how human beings perceive musical phenomena, how we like recognize different patterns and things like that. And he's talking, he's kind of apologizing for it in the introduction. He's like, well, this isn't really science, but it's not really metaphysics or religion either, and but blah 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 blah. And at the end of like the final sentence of the introduction, he's like, this is going to make you question absolutely everything about your modern worldview. Buckle up. And it's just like, yeah, dude, let's go.
Why is it going to change everything?
Well, so he's in the first few chapters that I've read this far. I have not finished this book yet, but he's talking about the Pythagoreans and the way they understood like the golden ratio and Pythagorean tunings, and he's showing all these different connections to like mythology and whatnot. And in particular, one thing that he's focusing on is this idea of the Pythagorean comma, which is something I think is absolutely fascinating. So if you don't know what that is, it's basically like if you take the circle of fifths and you loop it around in these like perfect mathematical ratios, you would expect it to just line up where you started. Like you start on a certain frequency, like the note F or whatever, you would expect it to loop back around and come back to F, but it doesn't. It misses it by a little bit. And the Greeks saw this as literally like indicative of the flawed, chaotic, evil nature of the world, because their idea of goodness was this idea of mathematical perfection. And this, I mean, they really angsted over this, right? The pentagram, for example, it became like a symbol of evil because of the way it was associated with the Pythagorean comma, the way that the planet Venus apparently traces out kind of a pentagram shape in the sky as it moves, but it doesn't perfectly like come back to its starting point, and that was taken to be the Pythagorean comma. So anyway, and so you get this really interesting thing where this idea of that flaw as evil kind of transforms over time, and then we start to get into things like microtonal music and things like that. And yeah, I don't know the full story and I haven't finished this book yet, but what he's getting at, it seems, is that there is this underlying kind of harmonic geometry to the world, and that looking at the world that way is just it reveals it in a completely different way than the more kind of like atomistic thinking, which, you know, thinking of the world as made of like particles and things like that. So yeah, it's just one of those things which illustrates what we were already kind of getting at, is like no matter what point of entry, no matter what rabbit hole you go down, it seems like you're always going to end up getting into something mystical and getting into something transcendental, something that really challenges the common parlance of things, as it were.
And that seems to be a side effect of the unseen, or the difficult to see, or the hard to wrap your head around. Like, we were watching a video on the color theory, and the Goethean spectrum versus the Newtonian spectrum. And there's very, very weird behaviors in it that are difficult to explain or comprehend. And I think that induces one towards more mythological thinking, because it's not a simple cause and effect where, like, if you're watching billiard balls move on a table after the break, there's something complex about multiple systems interacting together in an invisible way. Like the video that we were watching, he was making the case that once you pass this focused light off a halogen bulb through a prism, there is an invisible structure that is given to the light.
Yeah, it's crazy. And what's interesting here, so is the way that this stuff with light and color relates to, I guess you'd say, like the phenomenology of science itself, right? Like Goethe, so for example, that the way that he was looking at the emergence of the color blue through the interplay of light and darkness. So he's looking at like these opaque mediums, and he's shining like a perpendicular light through it, and you're seeing the darkness through this like semi-transparent illuminated medium, and it appears these different shades of blue depending on the opacity of it and whatnot. And so the Newtonian understanding of that would be something like, well, the darkness behind the medium is just allowing you to see the blue wavelengths, which are already being reflected by the medium. And Goethe saying, well, where are the wavelengths? You don't see that. Like, we're talking about the actual phenomenon of color, the actual appearance of the experience of color is clearly due to this interplay of light and darkness. Now, you can say that there are these invisible blue particles flying around even when the darkness is there if you want, but I can't see that, and I'm not worried about that because that's not what I can actually encounter empirically. I'm trying to be empirical about the actual phenomenon, right? And so again, this is a thing where we tend to juxtapose the mathematical materialistic science as being that which is more empirical, and then the mystical as being the, you know, up in the clouds somewhere. But really, like, Goethe and Steiner saw it in the exact opposite way. They were the ones who were being more true to what we actually encounter within our experience. Whitehead said the same thing. Whitehead was very adamant that the major problem with modern science was the way that it had reified these abstractions as though they were the world. And he was like, no, we need to go back to what we actually have in front of our eyes. And so the way that Goethe elaborates on this is really interesting, though, because he says the phenomena themselves are the theory. There's no need for anything else. And you start looking at what his theory really amounts to, then, you know, he's got these diagrams of like there's the light spectrum and the dark spectrum, and then he makes this kind of color wheel and whatnot. And you're like, okay, well, that's the theory, apparently. But you can see what he's saying. The phenomena are the theory, because that model that he's developing is just showing the relationships that we actually experience between different color phenomena. There's nothing extra there. There's no wavelengths. There's no photons. There's nothing that we don't actually encounter. And this is where things get weird, because then you got to ask, okay, sure, right? Like the color phenomena work in this way, so we're doing a kind of phenomenology, but what's underneath that? Like, are there photons?
What's the cause of the phenomenology?
Right. And I think that's a weird question to try and answer, honestly, because like, how do you maintain that kind of empiricism and then try to start getting underneath things?
You need the hypothesis, right? It's like you can't do the Newton and be like, I'm not gonna. Yeah, I mean, best case scenario is you have a lot of different hypotheses, actually.
Well, there's also another cognitive step that you have to make in order to even generate those hypotheses, which is that my perception apparatus is insufficient to actually see what is there. And so I see some projection of a deeper reality that makes it seem like something looks one way. But what I really have to do is I have to go deeper and I have to understand it better. Like there's this guy who has a really cool Twitter account where he just posts visual illusions exclusively.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this one that's really just breaking my brain lately, where it's a split screen of this cartoon drawing of a girl's face. And on one side, the face looks white, and on the other side, the face looks black. And the only difference is the contextual colors that are around that face. And then if you put it into Photoshop or something and then you sample it, it's obvious that it's the exact same color. There's also another really cool illusion, which is that you have a piece of paper printed with a gradient from gray to white, and you have a square that is some value of gray, and you stick it in the center, and it looks like it's one color, and then as you move that piece of paper into the darker space, it suddenly appears to look white, and then you move it over to the right, and it suddenly appears to be dark gray. And you can just continuously keep moving it back and forth, and it's like, okay, well, so then you have to include this aspect of perception. You have to include this aspect of the phenomenology is veiling something else, because obviously the thing is made of just cardboard. It's not changing. The change that I perceive is the change in the way that I filter things relative to one another. And so if I really want to understand nature, I have to figure out how to get past my own filters in order to be able to see what really is there. And that's the greatest challenge. That's what everything else is built upon, I feel like.
Well, I think the challenge is certainly how do we move beyond the sensory into that which produces the sensory? That's the big question here. But in the way you describe that, there are some things that I think are worth picking apart. So what does that tell us? You've got something that and again, let's just think about it phenomenologically. You've got a color, and then it's the same piece of cardboard, and then you move it, and then you've got a different color. Okay, so what that clearly shows us is that Newton's theory, whatever it is not a theory of color. If the same wavelengths are coming off of that piece of cardboard, then you cannot have a one-to-one relationship between frequencies of light and color. It's got to be something deeper than that actually produces the actual phenomenon. Now, the way that Newton would describe this, and he actually addresses this issue in some of his writings, he says, well, okay, so it's not really that the wavelength is the color, but like the colors are like our minds trying to identify the wavelengths. And so he's going with this very Lockean epistemology, where you've got this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So the actual phenomenology of color would then be a secondary quality that overlays, as it were, this world of primary qualities, which would presumably involve wavelengths of light, of photons or whatever. But that in itself, there's a lot of philosophical stuff packed into that. Because then you've got to start asking questions like, okay, so we have our experiences of things in the world, objects, and then we're thinking that those are secondary qualities, and then there's got to be something primary underneath that. What can that primary stuff be? What can this matter thing be, which has an objective reality which is different than our experience of it? And Henri Bergson, so he was a mathematician and philosopher, French, early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And the way that he addresses this in his book Matter and Memory is something that I just find to be the most incredible thing in the world. I just I smile every time I think about it. He says, okay, let's be good empiricists about this. All right, you've got your experience of the thing, and then you look away from it and you come back and it's still there. So, okay, so there's something to the object that is not your experiences of it. So what could that other thing possibly be? Well, your experience is a relationship to the object. So what could be the object of the object? If we're not going to go beyond that which we actually empirically encounter, we've only got two categories. We've got experiential relationships to the object, and we've got possible experiential relationships to the object. And then he then concludes, well, that's what matter has to be. It has to be a kind of complex of possible relationships between things. And so this is where things, because look, if you look at it that way, then that Newtonian / Lockean division between primary and secondary quality starts to break down, and it starts to turn into something else. It starts to become a distinction between that which is actualized within experience and that which is the possibility structure of such actualization, right? And so this is, I think, really what physics has kind of, in spite of itself, stumbled into within the quantum world, where we start talking about, well, this is a wave packet. So it's not one frequency, it's like a whole bunch of different frequencies at the same time somehow, but then there's this collapse of the wave function. What we're talking about here, what we're getting at, and this is something rather mysterious that I'm still trying to kind of sort out, but what appears to be going on here is that you've got these, that matter is not concrete stuff. The concrete stuff is the phenomenology. It is the actual relationships that come about as the world continually generates itself. That which underlies that is not this, cloud of little BBs bouncing around in the void. It's somehow forms, not necessarily in a Platonic sense, but maybe more like in the sense of what Sheldrake is talking about in terms of morphogenetic fields, possible activities, possible engagements between things, something like that.
Hold on, I want to show, I pulled this video up, and I think that it'd be illustrative to show it in context of this. Can you switch
I was going
to
to just say, or just resonant forms, right? So, even if, I didn't get to bring this up earlier, but even in terms of the atomics, if you look at what the chemists are doing for the shape of atoms, they're basically pointing at these resonant structures, which are emergent based on the vibration frequency. All right, let's check out what we got.
Isn't that crazy?
I love it. Oh, that's so incredible.
What are we looking at?
So there's the video starts with the square of gray in the center, and it's the same color as the center of the gradient. And then as you move it from left to right, it appears to change color relative to its context, which I think is exactly what Kehlan's talking about, which is the fact that the thing is not the matter that the square is made of. It's the context in which you see it and the relationship that is built on the back of everything else that it's interacting with.
Right. The physicality, the reality of the thing is its context. So we shouldn't say that, oh, it's the same color, but we're perceiving the same color differently. We should just be, we should describe it the way that a child would. The color is changing. Because I mean, really, if we're using the word color to describe the phenomenon, the experience of the color, then that is the truth. The color is not just this static block that's there immobile in relation to our consciousness. It is itself a relational phenomenon. And the way that this starts to get crazy then is if you really follow through on that, it's relational phenomenon all the way down. It's turtles all the way down. You don't get to the little BBs that don't care about our consciousness at some point once you zoom in far enough.
But this is the project of figuring out what actually is, right? Because if you take the
Yeah, I think that eliminating, first of all, the BBs are ridiculous for sure, but I think eliminating the substance as opposed to eliminating the need for the substance to be animated are two different projects to some extent. Like, I can still imagine substances animated by something fundamental that doesn't force me to think of little BBs causing the conscious behavior at the same time. I guess I just don't want to eliminate that possibility, because for me, there's a very real question. Like, I actually found this paper that I freaking love by this, actually an economist slash philosopher named Christopoulos. He wrote this paper that's just so good. It's called 111 Years of Magic Are Enough. Let Us Return to Science Now. And he basically, he's attacking relativity, but he's basically saying, hey, look, if you put a bunch of people in an auditorium and have them watch a magic show, they're all going to tell you the same thing happens. Like, this lady got sawed in half or whatever, right? And they have all these different perspectives. You can mathematically model it, do whatever you want. But at the end of the day, like, the lady put her legs up inside of the box and nobody thought to look inside of the box, right? And so I see this project of trying to understand what's manifest at those small scales, not as terminating in an endless sea of turtles or something, but fine, turtles is fine, but you do have turtles doing something down there. Now, whether they're informed by conscious action or not, that's a very different question for me. But just to stop at the point of perception seems to leave out a really interesting side of things. But I think it's scary to most people because you need hypotheses. You have to hypothesize that the woman's moving her legs up inside. You can't actually see it. And somebody else might hypothesize that the woman was born without legs in the first place, or they might hypothesize that there's mirrors hiding. There's lots of hypotheses you could generate, and I don't know that you can separate them out and come up with the capital T truth about a lot of these things. But
so this is where we have to be really clear about what we really mean by concrete reality. Because our ideas about what should be concrete are very much informed by this kind of mechanistic materialism. And I completely agree. I mean, I'm familiar with what you guys have done with the material atomics thing and the way that you're trying to actually describe the atomic world in terms of something that can actually be comprehended, as opposed
bodies,
to just
right?
as opposed to just taking an equation and being like, yes, well, this detector spitting out this number is this thing called a gluon, and well, gluons have never even been detected, but whatever, you know what I mean? You get this reification of these very abstract mathematical ideas, and that really is kind of going in the opposite direction of what I'm saying. But so I'm not saying that somehow it can just be this airy-fairy conceptual stuff all the way down. That's not exactly what I'm saying. But what I am saying is this: if we're going to say that it's got to be actors, it's got to be bodies actually doing something, then we're going to have to reconceptualize what we think a body is. And we're going to have to rethink it in terms of phenomenology here, again, with what I said about the color. If we take that same logic of saying that, no, it's not that our perception of the color is different. It is that the color is a relationship that is actually changing. Then we can start to rethink what the bodily, that idea itself implies about how these things are constituted. And this is really
or just that bodies isn't enough. Like I have a body, right? But that's far from who I am, right? And so is it possible that an atom has a body too, but that's far from what an atom is?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that would be true regardless. Insofar, so like with our bodies, for example, like yeah, what is the human body? Well, it's kind of a trajectory through time and space in a way. It's a series of concrete events that have happened, right? And then we don't really think of ourselves as being that. We think of that as part of our being, certainly, right? But then there's this other thing, and this kind of maybe alludes back to something we were saying much earlier with regards to like attunement, tuning into things. There's this kind of broader structure of possibilities there that's being tapped into when we make decisions. We never actually feel like it's just our body doing something, or when we do, we feel like we're not really there for it. You know what I mean? When we're doing something like completely habitual and mechanical. And so, yeah, but this I think is getting at exactly what I'm saying though, is that the bodily then really has to be understood as the activity of something else. And this is where things get strange, certainly, especially when we're trying to zoom in all the way into the realm of, you know, fundamental matter, the atom, the hydrogen atom, the things that we can actually, you know, put under a microscope
and
and
look
say,
below that even, right? Like an atom, you can at least be like, okay, it's this circle thing. But when you're like, well, what is the activity? Like, what are the actors doing that? I mean, I don't know if you can ever get to the bottom of that question, honestly. Even if you say, like we do, like, okay, it's made out of some sort of fiber that has some sort of shape to it. It's like, well, maybe that fiber is made out of other fiber. And maybe, you know, you just run into this wall where you're just like, how could you ever be certain that you're at the bottom of that story?
Well, I think that's what Keelan's pointing to, is that the bottom of the story is ultimately a relational one.
I got
right?
that, yeah.
So it's like if I'm looking can you switch this back over?
I mean, I'm really interested in this, and I'm really hoping that you can help me learn to talk better, because this is a huge problem I have, is that we do have this material atomics project, and so many people, when I start talking about this, they're like, oh, you're a materialist. And I'm just like, damn it. Like, I really couldn't feel further from a materialist as a human being, and like in the way that I perceive nature, but I still want to apprehend material mechanics for things. So I'm really orphaned with being able to communicate about the desire for that understanding. While
yeah, I mean, I think we're completely on the same page there, that like any kind of explanation has to be in terms of something that we can actually look and see and touch and whatnot. And we have to go beyond that, certainly. We have to be able to zoom in further than our eyes can actually allow for. But as far as like the fibers and, well, okay, so if you've got fibers, they have to be elastic. In order for something to be elastic, then you need smaller fibers, and then yada, yada, yada.
Exactly.
When we start thinking of these things as relational, this is where things start to get a little weird, I think. So with like the proton, for example. There have been these experiments done trying to kind of ascertain the geometry of the proton. And of course, they do what physicists do, which is shooting things at the proton and seeing how they bounce off. And what they find are these kind of scattering patterns, which seem to indicate that there's this more fine, more granular structure there. And the question I want to ask is, well, is that granularity there already, or is it that granularity is being generated by the relationships that we're creating through shooting things at the proton? And this might sound like I'm getting a bit more into the idea that there's something just like strictly virtual or holographic here, and so I want to be very careful with how I say this, because that's not really what I'm saying. I'm not saying that physical reality isn't really real or something like that, but I'm saying that if the relationality between things is actually what's making them what they are, then at some point I do think,
and that could just be motion, by the way.
Yeah, but at some point I don't think you're going to find a situation where you're zooming in and you just get this infinite fractal of fibers or something like that, because I think at some point it's like if there's no relevant relationality, and relevant relationality is what makes physical realities what they are, then there's no real concrete way in which you could say that a relationality is there strictly in potential, right? Like if that granularity that we're presuming to be there in the proton couldn't actually manifest in some kind of way, in what sense could we say that it's real at all? You kind of get what I'm saying? Like at some point we have to presume that realness and a capacity to participate in the world with other things are connected in some sort of way, right? Like that those really fundamentally are, I would say, basically identical, actually.
That's hard to argue with. I mean, it's almost a Zen koan. If a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. Isn't it kind of the same thing, where if there is something that cannot be interacted with on the level of perception, even with the finest instrument, does it matter that you can theorize it?
Right. It gets at something like that. Now, of course, with a tree in a forest, you've got a tree and you've got a forest. And so, there's all kinds of relationships there. But if you imagine and this is going to get pretty abstract, but imagine a universe in which there's only one entity.
Mm.
And you start thinking about like, okay, what would that mean for that entity to be real? Real in relation to what? That's this is getting us into far more abstract philosophical territory, but it kind of
but it's valid. You have to have two at least.
Right. You because if you don't have relationality, then you don't really have anything, do you? Right.
You can't have motion, right? You can't have motion without two. And motion being the most fundamental physical relationship imaginable, I think you have to have two. And honestly, like for a single thing to exist, it couldn't move, right? It has to have subunits in order to deform.
And so this actually strikes at the heart of why I think monism doesn't really work.
That brings us back to Steiner.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's impossible to imagine a one-item universe that is able to do anything except for be a perpetually still image, right? Because think of the way that you see motion. Think of the way that you measure time. Think of the way that events occur. You have to have at least memory of location in order to have a sense of time. Because I don't know how you think about this, but I've never bought into the idea that there's this background clock that ticks somewhere in the ether and then everything is measured against it. It's like you pick a clock that works for whatever it is that you're trying to measure. Like you wouldn't measure the number of pulses in a cesium atom if you're trying and then do celestial mechanics off of that. You would do celestial mechanics on the level of orbits around a central object because that's the relative time scale that matters.
Yeah, and this actually gets us into some this kind of gets us into relativity-ish territory, doesn't it? Because then within relativity, you have this conflation of time and clocks, which doesn't really leave any room for the possibility that processes might actually be taking longer, like more duration or less duration in relation to one another to occur. Because within that kind of Einsteinian framework, clocks are really all the time that there is. There's no other thing, and therefore if you can have differences in the rate at which clocks tick, then that is then taken to imply that there is no absolute simultaneity, and therefore there is not really any time at all. And Einstein absolutely believed that. I mean, he said that time itself was just a stubbornly persistent illusion, that the universe was really just a Spinozan block where our perception of being in time at all was just purely perspectival, purely relative to our limited scope. This is what Bergson and Whitehead both took huge issue with Einstein on this regard, because they saw it as just completely, really in a way, just sawing off the branch that science was sitting on in a way, because if you're removing something as fundamental as time and saying that it's just an illusion, well, then why not just saw off everything else? I mean, why not just say that our entire experience of the world is just an illusion? And at that point, you don't have science anymore. You have to have some kind of actual contact with a real world, indicated within your understanding of what human experience is, or you don't have empiricism anymore. You've got something, but it's definitely not science anymore.
If
And
they would have been honest and just called them clocks instead of time, I think we would have a much more rational basis for these theories.
yeah, but then our interpretation of that relativity would be completely different, I
Right.
think, than what you see in modern astrophysics, where it's taken to be like, this very literal thing where time only exists at all in regard to particular reference frames. If you're actually regarding clocks as clocks, not time itself, then it's just a completely different world. You don't get these same paradoxes, but then you have to understand time as actual processes taking time to occur in relation to one another, rather than it just being this kind of deformation of measurement, right?
So, do you have a model for time that doesn't involve measurement?
So Bergson and Whitehead both had very interesting ideas about time that I think synergize with each other very well, and also connect up with these other things that we were talking about with regards to like memory and attunement and whatnot. So for Whitehead, time is what he calls concrescence. And basically, you really have to have a little bit of an understanding of what Whitehead's whole system is to understand what he means by that. But basically, Whitehead believes that all of reality consists of self-organizing processes. There are no little BBs, because reality is made out of these kind of self-creating events, is a way to think about it, essentially. And what happens with time, what time really is for Whitehead, is this kind of dual motion where you have an inheritance of past actualities, which, again, what I was saying about the body, your body is kind of like the continuation of the events that have already occurred, right? There's this line of inheritance. But then the other side of that is the ingression, as he says, of possibilities. Just in our everyday experience, right? I'm talking, I'm making gestures with my hands. There's this very broad range of things that I could do, forms that could come to inform this moment. And in my conscious activity, I'm kind of selecting from them. I am evaluating them in some sort of way. And then that's then conditioning which possibilities are actually kind of feeding into the actualization of the present moment. And so that's the idea of concrescence. Then Bergson does something very similar, but kind of in the opposite direction, because he does it with memory, which is kind of, if you imagine this as kind of like light cones, you can imagine it as like that possibility space we're navigating is the cone that kind of goes up into the future. And then Bergson's talking about this kind of memory cone. And he actually does use these kind of cone diagrams as well, where different pasts are kind of available to be tuned into by the present moment. And what's interesting here with Bergson in particular, the way that he thinks about this is that the duration of actual processes, how long it takes them to take in relation to other processes, is determined by the extent to which the process, the organism, is actually kind of fanning out those cones in either direction. The more that we're kind of tuning into the past or looking to possible futures, the more the broadening of our consciousness is actually directly related to how long processes actually take to occur. And so within down here on Earth, that the Earth itself then kind of serves as this background in a way, because all of the atoms and whatnot that make us up are really just kind of doing the same thing at the same rate. But within our experience, we can see this happening, because we can say that, like, okay, when I'm doing something that's purely mechanical, when I'm just kind of going through the motions of something I've done a million times, I'm not thinking about it, we actually experience this kind of contraction of time. Time flies, as we say, because we're not thinking about it. We're not worried about going and doing something else. We're not elsewhere. We're just kind of doing it, and that's more mechanical. And for Bergson, that means literally a contraction of consciousness and a contraction of duration, a contraction of time. And so what this would then imply, if we're going to take time dilation seriously as a real phenomena, that clocks actually do tick slower within, the in orbit around the Earth or what have you. What I would take that to imply is that the clocks are ticking slower because the clocks are actually ticking slower. The durations are actually taking longer because somehow the difference, the removal from the Earth's influence is actually making it so that all of the microscopic processes of the atoms which are taking place are actually taking longer. And so this is something that I've talked about in some of my recent videos with regards to how astronauts.
By the way, just like to clarify, I think that they actually go faster, the clocks above the Earth, for whatever it's worth. But same difference.
Do they?
Is it slower?
I think that, like, when the clock's on Earth, it slows down. It's under more pressure, so it's slower. Gravitational time dilation, it's like, it's the thing.
They run
it would be
faster
velocity.
with less gravity.
Right.
Well, it would be velocity time dilation, technically, not gravity, if we're assuming the Einsteinian, right? Because gravity is supposed to make the clocks tick slower, not faster, but nonetheless, with actual satellites, the actual phenomenon we see is that they do tick slower, which is explained in terms of them having their relative velocity in relation to the Earth, right?
Yeah, so time goes slower on the ISS, lagging by 0.01 seconds for every year on Earth.
Okay, all right. Well.
So I think that this becomes really tricky because it depends on acceleration versus gravitational potential, and it's, the Einsteinian model is a thought experiment, and then when you go measure it, you get different results depending on the system that you're measuring.
Because acceleration also slows it down. Gravity slows it down. Yeah. You have a...
So just for now, disregarding the considerations of how we would interpret that in terms of relativity, the reality is that the clocks do seem to tick a bit slower. And so the way that I would want to interpret that then is that there's this actual dilation of the processes themselves and a dilation of actual consciousness, which is going on. And so what I've pointed to is the possibility that maybe we actually have evidence for this in the way that so many astronauts tend to have these very similar spiritual experiences in space. This is a very common thing, actually, where astronauts talk about having this overwhelming sense of like satori or oneness or being animated by some kind of spiritual power. And what I've speculated is that being in space literally opens us up to a greater receptivity to experiences like that, because it actually is a kind of and not a contraction, but a dilation of our awareness. It broadens it in a sense so that it's less laser focused on that which is immediately within like the sensory bodily perceptions.
That's really
a very long-winded answer, so sorry about that, but hopefully that answered the question.
I mean, I think you're onto something, that there is this relational shift in the way that we see things, and ultimately that relational influence on perception is what the project of science and maybe even mythology is trying to address. Because we know that there is this change depending on the context. And if there is the change depending on the context, then how do we achieve ground truth understanding if it looks one way in this context and another way in a different context? And you can, with going back to the squares of color, you can try to really grasp at, well, what is the color of the square? But then if you go and you put it into a different context, that melts away and you're left with this confusion. And so the only thing that you can really do is you can use, if you take a picture and you put it into a machine and then you use a Photoshop eyedropper to be able to look at the pixels, the machine will tell you that the pixels are the same color in both of the frames. And so then you're like, okay, the apparatus by which I perceive is busted, and so I will rely on the interpretation of the machine to tell me what really is, because it doesn't have this extra level of programming that confuses it. And so we dream of this ultimate machine that will be able to reach us towards an ultimate truth, because we recognize that our own systems are radically faulty when it comes to it.
And I think there's a lot of mistaken assumptions in that kind of thinking, frankly. Because we don't realize the degree to which our theoretical assumptions, our theoretical abstractions, get literally built into our machines. When we, like these particle colliders, or even our satellites, like our radio telescopes and things like that, the amount of filtering that these machines do is absolutely preposterous. I mean, they are taking in just titanic amounts of data and throwing away the vast majority of it. Well, how do you know what data to throw away? Well, because of your theory. And then you're using your machine to tell you that your theory is correct. And then what you end up doing, instead of actually stepping outside of the limitations of human consciousness, what you're actually doing is you're building a theoretical prison of like self-affirmation by cooking your own theories into your machines. And again, it's once we rethink empiricism a bit, I think we can avoid this trap, because then we can stop thinking that, well, there are these quantifiable, solid blocks of reality which are underlying our experience that have nothing to do with us. And we start thinking that the relationality that is human experience is the same relationality that makes the world what it is. Then we can start to look at this in a very different way. And then we're not going to have this kind of self-defeatist attitude about our experience anymore. We can recognize our own limitations, and we can say, okay, yeah, the way that I see this is maybe not the way that it's going to look in every context. It's maybe not the way that you're going to see it. But what I am seeing is actually revealing something that's actually real. It's not just these, qualia stamps that my brain is kind of slapping on to the raw data. The relationality is the phenomenology, and the phenomenology is the reality. And this is interesting to bring this back to Einstein then, because Einstein was, in a lot of ways, kind of trying to save physics from that kind of dissolutive power of relativization. Because if you want to make your physics more and more and more general, you got to make it more and more relative, right? And so you see this going all the way back to Galileo, with Galilean invariance, where he has the example of like the ship, and if it's moving at a constant velocity, then the physics will be the same. Newton just takes that a step further by saying that straight line velocities can be treated as states of rest, because from that perspective they are. And so Einstein is carrying this a step further, but he's realizing that you have to save objective reality somehow. And the way that he tries to do it is by sequestering invariance within the photons, within light. And does that actually save objectivity? I don't think it does. And I think we actually see that something much worse actually ends up happening when we look at this problem of actually measuring the speed of light. And you end up with this weird thing where, because Einstein has gotten rid of absolute simultaneity, you've gotten rid of absolute speed. Because in order to measure speed, you've got to have clocks that are actually synchronized or not. And if there's no truth to the matter as to whether those clocks are synchronized, if it's just a matter of what frame you're looking at, then the actual speed of light then becomes this thing that's, you can't say that it's an actual absolute. All you can say is that, well, if you bounce it off of something and we're assuming that this one clock is still ticking at the same rate, then we can say that the two-way speed of light is a constant. But then you can't say anything about whether it took the same amount of time going either way. And it's not, and I've seen a lot of people talk about this, and they all seem to misunderstand just how significant this is, because they look at it as an engineering problem, a technological problem. They're like, why can't we figure out how to measure the speed of light going one way? And they start looking at, well, maybe if we took the clocks and then synchronized them and moved them apart and whatnot. And they completely miss that it's not just that it's impossible as a technical limitation. It's impossible because conceptually there is no real time within the Einsteinian framework, and therefore there is no real speed. It's just whether you decide that the clocks are synchronized or not. And Einstein says this, and when he talks about this issue, he says, well, we can just define light as isotropic, same speed in both directions. And he emphasizes, he italicizes the word define, because he understands that it's not that it either is isotropic or it's not isotropic. It's neither, it's both. There's no objective reality to whether it is or it isn't. So he's like, well, we can just pretend that it is as a convention. But then guess what? All of your physics you start building off of relativity then becomes just a convention. It just becomes, oh, well, we'll just pretend. And then your objective reality just becomes this like social contrivance. And that gets kind of swept under the rug, and they're like, ah, yes, this is the real hard science. But anyway, what this illustrates then is that Einstein was trying to save physics from this kind of corrosive relativism, but he didn't actually do it. And because we've been pretending that he did do it, that's left us in this really weird position where I think that has a lot to do with why physics has painted itself into a corner. There's got to be another solution to that problem, and no one's talking about it.
I want to see if we can bring two different threads together. So on one hand, there's the corrosive influence of relativism and all of the problems that it's led to in physics and this corner that we've painted ourselves into. And then on the other hand is this idea that phenomenology is all we have, which to me seems like the ultimate relativism. And so how do you square those two in order to come out the other side with something that is more functional than the models that we have now?
And that's the key. That's how you break through to the other side, is asking that question. So one of my favorite thinkers ever is this guy named Jean Gebser, who is this Swiss/French/Spanish polymath. Like, he was like this renegade art critic /historian/anthropologist, and he has this nigh unreadable monstrosity of a book called The Ever-Present Origin, which I have been chewing on for like 3 years now, and it is incredible. And he traces out this narrative of the development of successive structures. He calls them mutations of human consciousness. And so he begins with like the earliest like shamanic animistic ways of thinking, and traces out this narrative through the emergence of civilization and eventually the advent of what he calls mental thinking, with like Plato and this kind of axial age type stuff. And excuse me. But the big monumental shift, well, it's more like a series of monumental shifts, but the one that's most relevant to what we're talking about right now is the emergence of what he calls perspectival consciousness, which begins during the Italian Renaissance. There are some kind of prefigurings of it that you can trace back a little bit further than that, but it's really during the Renaissance that this explodes onto the scene.
And that's traced through the emergence of it in art, where you suddenly start to see depth and perception in the paintings?
That's what he points to as an example of this, but there are many examples of it that you can look to in philosophy and poetry, and we'll get to that. But yeah, art is a great place to start because we don't realize how like monumental a shift it was with like the Mona Lisa, for example. The fact that you compare that to these like older like medieval frescoes and whatnot, you don't have depth perception, and you don't have like I mean, think about how just utterly eerie it is. We think it's so mundane now that the Mona Lisa is looking through an implied spatial window at the viewer. I mean, there's something really crazy about that. And if you look at just the way that perspective is studied just in like art school or whatever, they use these grid systems which kind of extend into this kind of implied space. And the way Gebser describes this is just so far out, man. He's like, it's not that suddenly space was becoming something that was a motif within art. Is that space was becoming a motif within human consciousness as such. And so you've got this perspectivity thing that's happening, and in a lot of ways you can see it as this horizontal flipping of the Platonic worldview. So within the Platonic understanding of the world, you have this kind of pyramidal scheme where at the top you have what they would call the hypokaimenon, so the fundamental ground of being, that which underlies everything else, which ironically is the thing that's at the top of the pyramid, but anyway. And the world just kind of trickles down from there. It's the trickle-down theory of reality. You have the ultimate monad or God or the one or the form of the good or whatever at the top. And then that's the ultimate perfect transcendental. And then everything kind of fans out from that. And it's like a projector. There's this lovely little Modest Mouse song called "The Stars Are Projectors," and whenever I see that title, it's a great song. But I just think like that's the Platonic worldview. Like they literally believe that the stars were like little pinpricks in the firmament, and that the light shining through them was the transcendental realm. But with this perspectival consciousness that begins to open up during the Renaissance, you have this kind of flip that happens. And you see it in the arts. The Platonic pyramid becomes the perspectival frame space of depth perception within the Renaissance art. And you see this then, you initially see it in art, and this is another crazy thing about it within Gebser's narrative. You see this over and over and over again. As these mutations of consciousness come about, they come about in art first. They're always prefigured by artists. Philosophers later on, and then it just kind of fans out from there. And then you see this in the Renaissance as well, because it's Descartes who is really one of the first to give philosophical expression to this. So and so what Descartes does, and there's so much in Descartes that's so revealing about what's going on here, he doubts everything that he possibly can, and kind of tries to back himself up into a point of absolute certainty, right? So first of all, what we were talking about earlier with the enantiodromia, things turning themselves upside down and inside out, this is the enantiodromia of the Christian worldview. The faith-doubt polarity is inverting within Cartesian thought at the exact same time that the Platonic worldview is getting flipped onto its side. And as that flip happens, so Descartes, he doubts everything that he possibly can, so he's backing himself into a corner until he can't doubt anything else. And what is he left with? What can you not doubt except the source of doubt? The Cartesian ego, the locus of paranoia, the locus of self-world alienation. Within the I think, therefore I am. That is not Descartes just making some stupid tautological statement about like, oh, well, I'm conscious and therefore my consciousness exists. No. That is the locus of a kind of really paranoid schizophrenia asserting its sovereignty as the core of human consciousness. So then the way this begins to play out within, and you see this throughout art as well, like within Rembrandt, for example, the Rembrandt Brown. Rembrandt is so prior to Rembrandt, it was very common for, well, almost all art was depictions of mythological figures or figures from Christianity. From Rembrandt, you start to see this transition towards this more immanent, more grounded thing, and you literally see it in the colors. The colors become more brown, and he's depicting these figures like the Mother Mary or Mary Magdalene or whatever, but instead of depicting them on the basis of way they are represented in other art, he would paint like people he knew, like his wife or his mother or whatever, as these figures. And so you've got this is another very common motif here, is the blurring of these lines between the transcendental and the immanent that's happening. So within physics, then, around the same time as Descartes, you start to get this with like Galileo and Kepler, right? So Galileo's looking up at the sky, and he's seeing these craters on the moon, and he's finding that there are moons orbiting Jupiter and whatnot. And the significance of this is that it wasn't that Galileo just, he said that the Earth revolves around the sun and the Catholic Church got mad at him. It's so much more than that. He was completely calling into question the metaphysical foundations of Western civilization, because within the traditional worldview, not just of Western civilization, but really all civilization prior to that, I mean, you see this exact same thing in like Chinese culture, within Egyptian mythology. It's all, you always have the same division between the earthly realm and the transcendental. We think it's so natural and obvious to think that up in the sky, up in the celestial realm, that's just more nature. This was not obvious at all at the time. The transcendental realm was the sky. I mean, it was literally like this, the idea that the stars and planets followed the same rules that we have down here would have seemed absolutely preposterous. And yet Galileo's looking and saying, hey, look, the moon isn't this perfect divine Platonic object. It has holes in it, for crying out loud. And then Kepler comes along. And up until that point, the Ptolemaic model of the solar system was simply more accurate than the Copernican. It just made better predictions. It was just a better model, and there didn't seem to be any way to fix it. But Kepler comes along with this idea that, oh, you can do elliptical orbits. Well, the Greeks would have had none of that. An ellipse is not perfect. It needs to be a circle. Circles are perfect Platonic objects. We have ellipses down here, not up there. But following Descartes, following these revolutions of consciousness that were happening at the time, suddenly that became a comprehensible idea. And it's finally going to be Newton then that really sets the stage here by developing his ideas, where the gravity is understood as that which determines the motion of objects down here and up in the sky. And he does that specifically through relativizing rest frames, by saying that constant straight line trajectories are states of rest from that perspective. And so that's how this whole thing gets set in motion. And so I know I've been talking for like 20 minutes now, but I'll wrap this up real quick and then we'll continue to roll with it. But what's happening here, the big picture, is that you've got this increasing perspectivalization of our understanding of the world, which allows us to then be able to see that things are different from different perspectives. And that's the challenge then. How do you move beyond that? Because there's an immense danger in that as well. And this is kind of what we were seeing with what I was saying about Einstein. But you see it, and I mean, Einstein's grappling with this issue is way downstream of the grapplings with this issue that we see in philosophy. We see it in Locke, in Hume, in Kant. It's all the same problem. Like, if our perspectival relationship with nature is something that has this kind of variability to it, then you end up with this issue where it's like nature is something else, is something that is always beyond our reach. It's always behind this like screen that is our consciousness. And then how do you break back out of that? That's the problem.
And so how do you?
Yeah, does this keep you up at night, or do you have an approach that works?
I think that we're at a point right now where, in general, we're starting to actually move beyond that, because, and I think it's directly correlated with this kind of resurgence of an interest in spiritual things that's happening right now. I think all these things are connected, but so Gebser says that you've got this perspectival consciousness, and if it just does its own thing, what it's doing is it's potentially laying the groundwork for what he's going to call aperspectival or integral consciousness. And the way that he describes this is really fascinating. Of course, there's two roads that you can go down. One is towards the light at the end of the tunnel he's gesturing towards, and the other one is everything just dissolves into social conventions. You end up with this. I mean, the best example of where the way that this perspectivity can kind of just devour itself is in Nietzsche's mental breakdown, I think. Because he really, this is a whole other story I don't want to go off on, but that's what happens when you get locked inside your own ego in such a way that you can't get out anymore. Now, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and Gebser calls this aperspectival consciousness. Which is, that word is a little bit iffy because it's not that it's not perspectival. It's more like maybe meta perspectival is a way to think about it. And the general idea here is that you have all these different perspectives and things look different from those different perspectives. The phenomenology has this kind of variability to it in the way that manifestations can occur. But then we can start to see through that, through this kind of insight, which is exactly the kind of insight that is implicated by science, by Goethe, by Steiner, seeing through the manifest into that which creates the phenomenological. So there's a phenomenology of the pre-sensory, as it were. So the language that Gebser uses here, he says that within that kind of aperspectival consciousness, the world is rendered transparent. Like, we're literally seeing through the physicality of things into that which gives rise to that physicality. And so an example that he gives of this once again from art is Picasso's work, where Picasso is giving these paintings of like somebody playing a violin or a woman walking down the stairs or whatever. And it's this crazy composite image of all the possible ways that you could look at it at the same time. And what Gebser's saying is that what's going on here is that we're beginning to see that underneath the specific concrete relationships, there is this kind of nebulous structure of possibility, but it's not just hot air. Like, it has a certain real morphology to it. It's a field. It's a morphogenetic field. It is like with the little piece of cardboard on the that you're showing that video of it moving back and forth. There's the color phenomenon, and then what underlies that somehow has to be all the possibilities which could be realized by that entity, by that object. And so anyway, just to wrap it up then, this is I think how we begin to really step into this we step out of a purely perspectival way of seeing things that's beginning to just devour itself and destroy itself, and into a way of seeing things where it's more like a kind of pluralism, where the underlying reality is seen in terms of possible relationships.
I love that because what
But
it.
possible relationships that are congruent with one
I'm
another.
just waiting for you to hit yourself in the face with that microphone. You swing it so violently. So you said what?
Like they're congruent with one another. That's what's interesting.
That's exactly where I was going to go, is that there is. So you can say that because there is a different perspective based off of your vantage point, that there's no shared reality. Right? There's the fracturing eternally. Or you can say that the different perspectives on the same phenomenon are giving you this higher dimensional perspective of what that actually is.
And so this is exactly what Bergson was getting at, right? This is exactly what Goethe was getting at. It all comes together into this idea that matter itself is not, it's not little BBs. The materiality of things is a kind of composite image, and that, you know, Gebser was actually friends with Pablo Picasso, and so like Picasso wasn't completely unconscious of this. He kind of understood that that's what he was doing. But yeah, this compositeness thing is important here, I would say.
I mean, I think that that's a useful and fruitful way of coming back to the idea that there is something unifying and underlying. Because if the project of postmodernism has been anything, it has been the project of there not being a thing in and of itself. And that seems to be a disaster because it brings in all of these just massive fractures inside of a society where how can you possibly agree on anything if there's no ground truth?
Right. And this goes right back to what we were saying about disempowerment. If there's no underlying reality, then there can be no underlying reality to what our shared purposiveness should be. We relinquish our capacity to steer the damn ship, and then who's steering it? Now, that question then leads us right back to what I was saying about the purposiveness of technologies, including economic technologies. They aren't just inert things. They have an inbuilt teleology as well that will eat the world, I would say, if we let it. You know, Heidegger was obsessed with this. He especially in his later career, he keeps on talking about the way that technology is unworlding the world, is the way that he put it. You know, again, very apocalyptic, but that's a real concern. And so moving beyond that kind of perspectival awareness into something that kind of transcends that in some sort of way, it's not just getting out of a trap. It's moving into a way of perceiving reality that has never happened before. The shamanic way of understanding the reality, we like people like Terence McKenna like to look back at that and kind of romanticize it, and for good reasons, totally. But for like a shaman living in the Amazon, seeing spirits and everything, it's not like that worldview can accommodate the idea that someone from a different culture could see different aspects of the same reality. For a person, that it is very literalist in a way. It's just like, this is how it is, period. But now we've got this, we're seeing into this kind of multidimensionality. I think that is a good way of thinking about it, that has never been visible to human beings before. Not really.
And I think that's a healthy way forward for our science and for our inquiry as well, where we're able to, and for just growth mindset in general, that there's perspectives that you should probably be open to considering, even though they don't go along with the way that you see things. It's like that's where the real progress happens, as far as I can tell. And right now, the way that science is done is it's very zero sum. It's like my idea or the highway. And so I think that that's actually a really promising future for a lot of these disciplines.
It's synthesis. It's, instead of saying that it is either this or that, it is to say that, well, it's probably both. And
right. Yeah.
Surely we can get farther with that than by staking a claim and saying it can be only this forevermore, because clearly that doesn't appear to be the case when you look out onto the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so then when we look at Steiner, for example, I mean, it's to bring this back to that, and what I was saying about, like, Steiner's not just drifting off into the clouds. He's saying some far out stuff. But what does he actually think he's doing? He thinks he's doing exactly what Gebser's describing, exactly what Goethe's describing. When we see through things, as it were, into that kind of compositeness. I mean, what we're doing, we're seeing the spirit world. That's effectively what it amounts to. I think Carl Jung was doing the exact same thing. There's so much more to things, and that perspectival kind of birth canal that we had to very precariously make our way through is allowing for the possibility of that. And once you start looking at the world in that way, it starts to get real weird. It starts to get real far out, because then you can start saying things like, with like color, for example. Steiner wrote extensively about the implications of Goethe's color theory, and it's wild, man. He's talking about like the different kind of moral impulses within different shades of pink and stuff like that. And it's just like, dude, what are you talking about? But I mean, that's the kind of trajectories that begin to open up to us for how we understand things. And I don't think it's just a more poetic alternative to science. I think this is a transformation in the way that we see things that's going to completely transform what we think of as science, in all kinds of ways. Yeah.
And that might be a good place to put a pin in it for today. I feel like my brain is full now. I need to go and digest some of this stuff. But yeah.
I mean, these are ideas that we've circled around for a long time, where there is something that is missing from a deeply rationalist perspective of the world. You can only get so far, because there's the question of how something happens, but then there's also the question of why something happens. And in order to really have a sense of the way that nature operates, surely you must have both. And physics will never be able to reach the question of why, because that is a question of wills and spirit and a different domain of existence. But you still have to have those answers. You can't just be like, well, it's causeless. There's no reason why. And you see this. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, let's leave it on a very tantalizing question then, right? What if physics actually could do that? Right? Like, what if we completely rethought what physics is?
I don't know if it would be physics anymore, but
I don't know either, but it would be something, wouldn't it?
So I would, if you expanded physics just to be science or something like that, I could see that happening for sure. I just think physics is less. It's less important than people give it credit to. It's like the king of the science castle for some reason, and I think this is why Sheldrake is often abused by his peers. But I don't think that what he's saying is outrageous. It's like, why did the physicists get to be in charge of the celestial mechanics and not the biologists? Like, because, well, we don't know for sure if the stars are alive or not, but like, why can't we entertain that idea? Like, what's to prevent us from entertaining wills and so forth? And it's like, it sounds so ridiculous in the current paradigm to even suggest such a thing, but it's a fundamental assumption. It's just the way that we've processed that information through the lens of it being physics. And so I see what you're saying, like, what if physics could explain that? What if science could and physics was just a little piece of the puzzle all of a sudden? I guess that's another tangential question.
But I can also see it in the way where Descartes has the tree of, is it the tree of philosophy or the tree of knowledge? Because he has like the root of the tree is metaphysics, and then everything else branches off of your metaphysics. And so right now we have a deeply rationalist metaphysics, which says that there's only this scope of possible actions to be taken. Mm-hmm. And you can combine chemistry, biology, and physics and maybe art and music in order to be able to operate in that realm. And so if you change the metaphysical principles, the tree must grow differently. It's like you've grafted something onto, a walnut, and then you get a different fruit. Like, we know that already happens. And so what happens when the metaphysical trunk is fundamentally shifted? None of it will look the same.
So there's a wonderful quote by Alfred North Whitehead, which would be it just ties all of this in a bow. I think he says that biology is the study of the larger organisms, while physics is the study of the smaller organisms. So yeah, that definitely points towards exactly what I think we're getting at here, that somehow this metaphor, this core metaphor of mechanics, needs to be kind of expanded and augmented to become a core metaphor of animacy. And that's the path forward, I think.
Awesome. Yeah.
I love that.
Let's stop right there. That's killer. Thank you, Kehlan. It's been awesome hanging out with you.
You want to plug where people can find you?
Let's talk about your channel.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Formscapes, Formscapes, Formscapes. That's my YouTube channel. I also have a website, formscapes.org. You can go check that out, where I have the scripts and whatnot to things. I'm not currently doing this, but I also host like webinar courses through my website as well. I'm probably going to be getting some more of those going within the next month or two. And I have a Twitter if you want to see me posting stupid memes and stuff. And that's pretty much the gist of it. Yeah. So, thank you so much for having me on, guys. This has been an extremely engaging conversation, to put it mildly. And we should absolutely do this again sometimes. I think we definitely left off on like a note that we are obligated to pick back up on. So I trust that we're on the same page on that. So, but yeah. Thank you so much again.
That's the best case scenario, yeah. I think Larry Crane told us one time, like, the best interviews end too early. And I'm like, yeah, that's good, because we could do more of them, so.
But yeah, let's pick it up in another couple weeks.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's do it. All right. So, stay in touch, guys. This was great. And, I'll see you later.
All right. See
you. All right, have a good one.
Bye, everybody.